Today we're reviewing the Intel Arc B570 Battlemage GPU, following up the B580. The price for this is supposed to be $220 US. The B580 launched at $250 for the baseline pricing, and that means that the B570 is actually one of the cheapest new generation cards that we've reviewed in years at this point. So, close competition. Includes the 4060, sort of, it's $300 or so, and the 7600 at around $250, plus or minus a bit. The 6600 and the 6600 XT really are the most similar in price, at least at one point, to where this is today. Now, this review is a little interesting because Battlemage overall had a pretty good launch. It was well received by and large. It had a couple caveats, just like the Alchemist GPUs of the first generation of Intel Arc. But Battlemage more recently, the story has been around, but what happens if you pair a B580 with a lower end CPU? So we went through and we added the 12400 and the 5600X at fixed clocks for another round of tests in addition to our 9800X 2D platform. We ran several cards through it. The short answer to the question of whether it changes the performance in a way that reflects in our particular approach to reviews is no, it does not. There's one scenario where it really shows up. We'll talk about that, but for the most part, there's not really any change. And so we'll talk through why that is and where the overhead exists. It does exist. It's a real thing. It just doesn't materialize in the way we test. But that makes this pretty interesting. There's a lot of charts. It's like doing all the work 3 times, but we were able to do it where there's only 2 times the amount of charts. Great. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Antec C8 cases. We reviewed the Antec C8 ARGB a few months ago and found it to be an overall competitive performer using unique 160mm fans. There's also a version without included fans, and it's competitively priced while still offering attention to detail key elements like the airflow partition for better directing air intake. It also has high-quality kill management grommets and limited obstructions for bottom air intake. The ARGB variant includes all these features, but also 2 160mm reverse blade fans and one 140mm fan. Learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so I am actually really excited about this because doing bottleneck testing is always really fun. It is cool to see how stuff performs on high end or low end versus what you normally do. So we'll talk more about that. But we'll link our B580 review if you want more detail on frame time pacing. That discussion's in that video. And on the basics of the architecture, there's a few unique frame time pacing issues with Battlemage. Those persist on B570 when they're present. But they have done a good job at getting rid of the really, really common ones that were present in the A series, A770, A750. So Intel's on an improvement arc, not intentional, but they do still have some hurdles to tackle. All right, so for a quick recap of the specs. The B580 GPU is a 20x E-core configuration on 5 render slices. It has a 190 watt claimed TBP, or total board power, 12 gigabytes of GDDR6. Memory bandwidth is relatively high for a card of this class, 456 gigabytes per second. The B570 card drops 2 of the XE cores to land at 18 and is still set up on 5 render slices. RT units get cut down as well. They match the XE cores. And TBP is 150 watts. The memory is set up at 10 gigabytes, and that's still GDDR6, but with 380 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. The memory interface is a smaller 160 bits on the B570. Here's a quick pricing recap. At the time of writing this and ahead of launch, we checked Newegg and Amazon for several GPUs. The Intel B580 GPU is mostly out of stock at the actual MSRP and being scalped at the time we're writing this. On Newegg, it's $340 and up right now, which is way too much to pay for that card. It's likely that when this video launches, the retailers will restock with some B580s that are closer to normal, but we can't review the future, although we can see it. We normally scry a pool of liquid metal. We can see the prices a couple days out. Don't try that. The RTX 4060 is currently around $295 to $320 with units regularly available at $300, and the AMD RX 7600 is $250 as of writing this, making it the closest price competition on a relatively modern architecture. It is more directly competitive with the B580 by price than it is the cheaper B570. Enough of that. We have a lot of charts to get through today. So we have tests with 3 CPUs on them. The way this is set up is we have the 9800X 2D platform, the 12400 platform, and the 5600X platform. The 5600X is configured such that the all-core frequency is locked to the same frequency as the max single-core boost. So what that does is it controls the variable so that we don't have the CPU bouncing around and following a precision boost curve in a way that won't necessarily be identical run to run. We do the same thing with the 9800X3D. We lock it at a frequency. And then the 12400 is in here as well. That gives us an Intel platform to look at from one of Intel's best recent generations that didn't have massive problems. And then the typical sort of philosophy for testing, there's a lot of ways to do it. As long as you kind of explain it and can defend the choices as a reviewer, then whatever, it's fine. The way we view it is the objective is to isolate the variable, simply because having a lot of variables makes it really complicated really fast, and you just got to pick. You're trying to represent sort of one situation or as many of them as possible. And so we do a high-end platform for GPU reviews where the CPU is intended to not bottleneck the GPU. That is sort of the traditional approach. And then we also, for CPUs, we do the opposite. We have a high-end GPU with CPUs. And all of that's intentional. We've explained it over the years, but that's kind of the approach to it. And it's just to isolate variables and eliminate unnecessary bottlenecks so that we can try and bind the thing that really matters. The thing we're doing here is a little different. We are introducing the CPU as a potential variable, reducing the performance of the CPU with the 5600X and the 12400 in addition to the 9800X3D. And what that does is there will be situations where the CPU simply can't keep up with feeding frames to the GPU because it's got its own problems going on. This can get complicated depending on the games being tested in the settings, because if you start bouncing off of a CPU ceiling, it can really screw up the frame times, and that might not be sort of the fault of the GPU, but as the end user, it all manifests the same way, which is just a terrible experience if it's the wrong combination of things. And so that's something we're going to be looking for today. Now, the current topic, at least as we've seen it sort of discussed mostly in the comments, is where I've been paying attention to what's the public understanding of this right now, is that Intel may be disproportionately hurt by driver overhead, and that has been attached to lower resolutions. It's been attached to 1080p. Really, based on what we've seen so far, what it should be attached to is low GPU load, but 1080p is often synonymous with that. So it's an important distinction. We'll show you why, but it's a distinction to be made. Now, our testing is done with all the same games and game settings we use for our 9800X3D testing. So we're using high or ultra type settings and basically playing it like most people would, where you're trying to sort of get the most out of your GPU, max out the settings. But we've lowered the CPU quality to those two mentioned. And that means that even 1080p for our testing approach will often still be GPU bottlenecked, especially on these cards. And that's just because of the way we've set it up. We try to force the bottleneck onto the GPU, but also represent a likely scenario. So anyway, let's get into the numbers. We're focusing on how the GPUs scale from one CPU to the next, rather than just the GPU to GPU comparison differences. This chart is for Final Fantasy XIV at 1080p. We'll highlight all of the B580 rows first. With the 9800X3D, the B580 ran at 124 FPS average. With the 5600X and a fixed all-core frequency, it was 122. With the 12400, it was 120. There is no substantial change to the B580's performance across these three CPUs with this test configuration. Moving to the 4060 on the 9800X3D bench, 5600X bench, and 12400 bench performed identically. It was about 112 to 114 FPS average on all of them. There's no substantial change to performance. The RX 7600 saw a performance drop on the i5 12400, but on the other two systems, it was about the same. The B570, we observed approximately equivalent performance from the 12400, 5600X, and 9800X3D. As such, the percent difference between all these devices is overall comparable in this test, despite which CPU is used. Across all tested devices, we did, however, observe a reduction in 0.1% low performance as the CPU was reduced to lower performance levels. For example, the RX 7600 with the 9800X3D at 84 FPS, 0.1%, versus with the 5600X at 62.1. This is expected. Here's the 1440p test. In this one, we did not observe a meaningful difference in B580 performance across all three CPUs. The same is true for the 4060 and the 7600. We're not able to detect any differences beyond slight variance across platforms. The B570 also does not scale differently and scores almost identically on all three. The data consistency for average FPS actually is remarkable there, and this means that the unbound data later will be sufficient for establishing differences between averages. As for the lows, we're seeing consistently reduced lows on the lower end CPUs in this game. It's not always true, it is here. The 5600X and the 12400 both had worse 0.1% lows than the 9800X3D with B570. With the RTX 4060, we're seeing stable 0.1% lows across all three devices. With the 7700 XT, we saw differing lows between the 9800X3D and the 12400. With the 7600, we saw stable lows across all three. It would appear that, based on the B580, B570, and A770 data, there may be an argument in this specific game and with these settings where there are worse lows on lower-end CPUs for Arc disproportionately. We'll need more games. To finish Final Fantasy, though, at 4K, everything's remarkably consistent. This mostly includes the lows as well, although there are exceptions, like the 9800X3D and the 5600X for the A770. Broadly speaking, all GPUs are about the same here across all configurations in terms of their card against itself measurements. This is Cyberpunk at 1080p Ultra. We'll go through it fast. The results do not change CPU to CPU. The only differences are on the 4060, where we see worse lows on the lower end CPUs, and the 7700 XT, where we see a change in 0.1% lows. The B580 and B570 do not exhibit a change. In fact, realistically, the CPU change does not affect any of these results with regard to how we do a standard review. They are the same from our testing perspective. This is GPU bound, so that's what you'd expect. Some of the internet has lost the plot and think that Arc bad 1080p, but it's really not that simple. It depends on the GPU load and the game. Starfield is known to be problematic for Arc. We have that discussion in the standalone chart for it, but we'll focus on the scaling only within a given card here. We did not observe a difference in the relative ranking of the B580 or the B570 versus their competition in this test. Relative percent scaling did not get worse with lower end CPUs. At 1080p, there's a slight difference at the top end with the 7700 XT and the 12400 as a potential CPU bind comes into play. The RTX 4060 is identical in average FPS performance across all three CPUs. However, we observed worse frame time pacing on the 5600X and the 12400 for the RTX 4060. Ultimately, they are the same level of reduction from the 9800 X3D, so the two lower end CPUs are comparable to each other. The RX 7600 is identical in average FPS performance and within variance on all three. Again, the 9800 X3D has a slight advantage in frame time pacing. The B580 is identical on all three for average FPS. There's no meaningful difference in frame time pacing or 0.1% low performance. Note, though, that the B580 has some troublesome lows in this game already, but they don't get worse for lower end CPUs. That may be because they are already sort of just reduced from Intel Arc drivers to begin with. The B570 is the same, and the results are within variance for all three metrics. This is Resident Evil 4 at 1080p. The 7700 XT exhibits a slight ceiling with the 12400, but is mostly comparable. The B580 ran at 128 FPS average with the 9800 X2D and 122 with the 5600X. We didn't run tests on this one for the 12400 configuration. The B570 had all three, though. The 9800 X2D has it at 110 FPS average, or 5% ahead of its 5600X configuration for the B570 and 5.7% ahead of its 12400 configuration. The RTX 4060 ran at 107.9 FPS average on the 9800 X3D and 106.5 on the 12400. The RTX 4060 shows a top to bottom range of 1.3%, smaller than the observed difference on the B570. This slightly reconstructs the stack such that the B570 ends up slightly tied or under the RTX 4060 rather than ahead of it by 2.1% when you look at the same CPU that they're paired with. However, the reduction puts the 4060 on like-for-like hardware maximally 2% ahead. So between the two, realistically, they are about the same experientially. As for the 0.1% low performance, the Arc cards underperform compared to the RTX 4060 on all CPUs. This does not get disproportionately worse on the 5600X or the 12400 and instead scales with the average. This disadvantage in lows exists on the 9800 X2D standard CPU and on the lower end ones. Next is Baldur's Gate 3. We only run this at 1440 and 4K due to the low load. In this test, the 7700 XT found a hard bottleneck with the i5 12400. This capped out at 79 FPS average as opposed to the unbound test at 133. This would be appropriate for a CPU review, but does not show GPU performance. The RTX 4060 on the 12400 further reinforces these limits, although it bounces off of them way harder with much worse 0.1% lows as a result of the CPU, not the GPU. The RTX 4060 exhibits identical average FPS with all three configurations. The lows are better on the 9800 X3D as it allows the GPU to hit frame pacing without external binds, which is expected behavior. The RX 7600 is restricted by the CPUs with the 5600X and i5 12400, with both lower than the 9800 X3D's result. Again, this is normal and is expected from a CPU bind. Lows are hurt as a result of the limited ceiling. The B580 also experienced a performance reduction with the 12400, but a much larger one with the 5600X. So to do some quick math, the RX 7600 at 77.1 FPS average with the 12400 gains 11.1% by moving to the 9800 X3D. The B580 with the 12400 at 63.7 FPS average gains 16.2% by moving to the 9800 X2D. It's not as big of a difference as we might expect, but it is larger than what we saw with the 7600. The 5600X is a far different story with a maximum uplift of 32% from the 5600X unit to the 9800 X2D at 74 FPS average. This is not just the CPU bind. That may well be the driver overhead discussion. The B570 shows similar behavior, with scaling worse on the 5600X than on the 12400. Lows are not disproportionately worse on any of them for that one. In other words, the lows follow the behavior relative to the other devices also scaling with the CPU. This would possibly change our recommendation for a 5600X user, but not for a 12400 user, where the difference there is only 3 FPS in the B570. At 4K, the 7700 XT is the same on both CPUs for average FPS, but worse in frame time pacing on the 12400. This is expected behavior when using a worse CPU. The A770 has identical performance between the 9800 X2D and the 5600X. The RTX 4060 has identical performance between all three. There's a 1.3 FPS average difference as a result of not only run-to-run variance between the three, but also the frame time pacing is much better on the 9800 X2D for the 4060, and that influences the average results. The RX 7600 has the same average FPS on all three CPUs with better frame time pacing on the 9800 X3D. The B570 is identical on all three CPUs with better lows on the 9800 X3D. All of this is expected behavior for a GPU bind. Black Myth will be fast as well at 1080p high, which is our standardized test platform. There is no meaningful broad difference in scaling. The numbers do not change in any meaningful way for our testing. The 7700 XT is the same on both. The 4060 is the same on all three. The 7600 is the same on all three with the exception of reduced lows on the 12400. The B580 is the same on all three and lows are within variance run to run. The B570 is the same on all three with lows within the wider variance at the low end, and the A770 is the same on both that we ran. Let's look at one more. In Dragon's Dogma 2, they are all the same from CPU to CPU with a few notes. The 7700 XT is roughly identical. The 4060 is mostly identical, with the 12400 potentially showing marginally worse performance. The RX 7600 is the same across all three, with slightly worse 0.1% lows on some of them. The B580 is the same across all three, with worse 0.1% lows specifically on the 5600X. The B570 is the same across all three in all three metrics. The A770 is the same in all three metrics. So let's quickly talk results first. In most scenarios, for our testing, there's no meaningful impact. That does not mean there is never impact. There can be. The key here is in our testing, and the biggest situation we saw was with the 5600X with Baldur's Gate 3, I think it was at 1440p, where we saw sort of a stair step. It was 5600X, 12400, 9800 X3D. It starts to look like a CPU review does, where in a CPU review, you're going to see scaling with CPUs. In this scenario, though, the 5600X was sort of disproportionately low, and that was especially true on the B580 we looked at, the B570 in some situations, whereas the 12400 and the 9800 X3D were much closer to each other to the extent that between the two, there is functionally no meaningful difference. So one of them was like 3 FPS difference. Who cares? It's kind of all the same conclusion one way or the other. So in that scenario, the only thing that would really change for us is the recommendation for a 5600X user for that scenario might change. By and large, though, there's not a huge swing here, with the exception of some 0.1% low numbers shuffle around, but it's not always just on Battlemage. It just depends on the game and the card. So the short version of it is this. This doesn't affect our review here because our approach is already built in a way to heavily load the GPU. And so we want to make that clear that there is no data with our testing to support that our conclusions would be meaningfully different in a wide sweeping way if we tested it with the low-end CPUs or the high-end CPUs. But in this video, you get both. And so you can kind of make that decision yourself if you want, but the numbers are functionally identical in most situations. So what it does do is cap the ceiling, and you can see that. Now again, that's not to say there's not driver overhead, and we are aware that at this point multiple outlets have shown situations where you can get it. One of the trends I've noticed between them is that a lot of the times it's on really high frame rates. It's like 200 FPS plus, you'll start to see it emerge more. And then it also seems to trend with some of the esports type games, which we don't currently really test. And so maybe that's a next content piece for us, but for purposes of the review, what matters to us is, okay, well, we've got a review suite. Let's test this current discussion with our review suite and see if it needs to change. And the answer is, well, not really, but even if you cared, then there's the numbers for you. So anyway, we may revisit this with some of those super high FPS titles, esports titles, whatever, in a separate video. But for now, you've got the information to work with. So if you want to see scenarios where some of that driver overhead that's being discussed might emerge, we'd encourage you to check out other reviews. There are plenty of them out there where they're probably going to be looking into it. Some people will have examples and others won't. It just depends on what you test. Okay, let's get into the rest of the charts. We're going to go through it standard now, and that includes rasterization and ray tracing because we spent so much time on this thing up front. We won't have as much length on the efficiency, but there is efficiency at the end. Here's the rest. Final Fantasy XIV at 4K is up first for the unbound benchmarks on the 9800X3D. In this one, the B570 ran at about 41 FPS average, establishing a 16% advantage for the B580 at 47 FPS average against a 14% price bump by MSRP. So this is pretty close to linear. The B570 roughly ties the A770 in average FPS at 1% low, with 0.1% lows close enough. It also outperforms the RTX 4060 by 11%, the 3060 by 23%, and the A580 by the same. The RX 7600 card landed at around 32 FPS average, giving the B570 a notable lead, especially at the price. There are also substantial improvements on the RX 6600, which was the previous leader in this price class, though it eventually sold for cheaper. For some references to older cards, we also have the GTX 1070, 1060, and 1650 present. You can pause for those. At 1440p, the B570 ran at 75 FPS average against the B580's 86 FPS average, which puts the B580 about 15% ahead of the B570. The lead was marginally higher at 4K. The B570 now sits between the A770 and A750, so the A770 has slightly repositioned itself as resolution came down. The RTX 4060 also gets closer to the B570, now at 72 FPS average, nearing equivalence despite a larger gap previously. This is the same behavior we saw in the B580 review. The higher the resolution goes, generally speaking, the more of an advantage Battlemage can develop over some of its peers in the class. The lead over the RX 7600 is 14% here, with the RX 6600 XT and 3060 below it. Some older reference anchors include, again, the 2060, the 1070, the 1060, and the 1650. You can pause for those. And frame time pacing on the B570 is good overall, performing similarly to 4060 for frame-to-frame interval. At 1080p, the B570 loses its advantage against the RX 7600 and RTX 4060. The B580 maintains a lead over these two cards with its 124 FPS average, although its frame time pacing, indicated by the 0.1% lows, is worse than what we're seeing on the RTX 4060 and RX 7600. We dove into this in the B580 review. Overall, Battlemage and the B570 remain a large improvement over Alchemist, especially at the price. However, we still see that reduction in relative performance as resolution decreases, even with an unbound configuration. At 1440p and higher, Battlemage, when unbound, seems to be more competitive than it is at 1080p. Starfield is next. Intel had a lot of problems with Starfield when the game launched. Namely, the problem was it didn't work. But it does now. Sort of. Despite working, NVIDIA and AMD retain an advantage with the RTX 4060 and the RX 7600 cards. The B580's 41 FPS average at these settings leads the B570's 36 FPS by 12%. The RX 7600 leads by 17%, with the RTX 4060 leading by a staggering 31%. This is an example of one of the games where Battlemage is disadvantaged even when unbound, even at 1440p. At 1080p, the B570 GPU ran at 47 FPS average, placing it between the A770 of last gen and the RX 6600 XT. Against Alchemist, it's clear that Battlemage is a huge improvement when considering the configuration size of the A770 GPU against the B570 GPU. Against itself, Intel has definitely improved in huge ways. Against competition, the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 both hold advantages at both the resolution and with the game. The B580 ends up 10% ahead of the B570 in this test, so its value isn't always linear. Resident Evil 4 at 4K was one of the B580's strongest titles. In this test, the B580 marginally outperformed the 4060 Ti in averages, with the 0.1% lows close enough to be comparable given wider margins. The B580 at 46 FPS average leads the B570's 40 FPS average by about 16%, aligning with some of the other 4K results. The B570 ends up outperforming the RX 7600 by 7% and the RTX 4060 by 14%, which is an incredible lead for the B570 when fully GPU bound. Considering the RTX 4060's price, this is, again, a big improvement for Intel. The improvement on the A580 is also noteworthy with similar gains. Lows on the B570 are not meaningfully different from those on the RX 7600, the 6600 XT, or the RTX 4060, so frame pacing is similar on those. At 1440p, the B580 is still spaced about 16% over the B570. The B570's lead over the RX 7600 has reduced, and they are now mostly equivalent, with the B570 experiencing less consistent lows. This is something we showed and talked about in the B580 review, so if you'd like to learn more about why it hits that ceiling, you can watch that one. The RTX 4060 also climbs relative to the B570, with its 70 FPS average results reducing the B570's advantage to just 6%. This is while the RTX 4060 maintains slightly better 0.1% low results for a better average frame-to-frame interval. The B570 is still overall better here, but as we continue to reduce resolution, that changes. This is 1080p. With these settings, the B570 is now roughly tied with the 7600. The RTX 4060 is encroaching on the B570, which has had its lead when GPU bound cut to just 2%. That's still impressive for the price and for the new age of Intel's new architecture. If we imagine the B570 line item were some hypothetical new NVIDIA card at the same price and performance here, $220, this would be an amazing move in the right direction for NVIDIA. The fact that it's Intel, and Intel is still proving itself and working through some of those early teething pains, is really the only hesitation that remains. They have, however, reduced that concern generationally so far. Even still, the B570's frame time pacing is inconsistent. It bounces around in this title run-to-run, with run-to-run variance higher than we'd see on AMD or NVIDIA devices. This remains a challenge in some specific games, but not all. It's overall acceptable, but not as consistent as its peers. As for the B580, its lead over the B570 is about 18 FPS, or 16.4%. Next up is Baldur's Gate 3, which remains one of the best titles launched in the last couple of years. At 4K, the B570 ran at 40 FPS average with our ultra settings. This has it just below the 3060 and above the A580, RX 6600, and RTX 2060. The B580's 44.8 FPS average result leads the B570 by 13%, with both exhibiting limited scaling in the 0.1% lows, indicating frame-to-frame consistency issues as compared to NVIDIA neighbors. 1440p has the B570 at 67 FPS average between the A750 and the A580. The generational uplift isn't nearly as impressive here as in some of the other games. The B580 is about 11% better than the B570 here, so that's not as high elsewhere either. And the RTX 4060's 80 FPS average puts it 20% ahead in average FPS, plus a significant uplift in 0.1% lows to represent smoother frame time pacing. The RX 7600 outperforms both the 4060 and the B570, including in the lows. Let's move to Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty at 1440p. In this test, the B570 ran at 46 FPS average, with the B580 at 54 FPS average. The B580's lead is about 16%, which is consistent with other high load scenarios. In fact, the B580 bordered on the RTX 4070 in this test, which we didn't see happen elsewhere, but which has consistently happened in this game. Its lows aren't nearly as good as what the RTX 4070 offers at 50 FPS 0.1% to 31, but this was still a good showing in averages for Battlemage. If they were to even out the lows, then that average might come down a little bit depending on where they're spiking. The B570 reinforces this. It functionally ties an average with the 6700 XT. This is an impressive feat for both. It's the memory bandwidth we think benefiting the cards here. Unfortunately, the low pacing just isn't as good on the B570 as its neighboring devices, including the larger config A series like the A750. The B570 leads the 4060 by 18% here in a staggering flip favoring Battlemage for averages, again with the caveat being the lows are better on NVIDIA. At 1080p, the B570 ran at 71 FPS average, with B580 sustaining a 13% uplift in average frame rate. Battlemage still has worse lows than neighbors. At this resolution, the 4060 begins to encroach on the B570 and functionally ties it in average frame rate while offering substantially improved frame pacing behavior. The RX 7600 is about the same, roughly tied with the 4060, and overall a better experience than the B570. Black Myth Wukong is next, tested at 1080p high first. With these settings, the B570 maintains about 40 FPS average with lows around or below 30 FPS averaged. This has the RX 6600 XT and RTX 3060 both above the B570, with the B570 above the 6600 non-XT and the RTX 2060. The B580's 46 FPS average gives it a lead of 15% over the B570, with the 7600 16% ahead, and the RTX 4060 at 54 FPS average here, ahead of the B570 by 36%. It's a huge lead for the 4060. At 1440p, the B570 is reduced to 30 FPS average. This gives the 4060 a 22% lead, with the B580's 35 FPS average about 15% ahead. So the B570 did gain on the 4060. The 4060, however, still maintains a huge lead. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up next, first at 1440p max without RT. In this test, the B580 sticks to a 15% lead over the B570, so that's consistent. The RTX 4060 leads the B580 and the B570 alike, with the RX 7600 about tied with the RTX 4060 and within run-to-run variants. The B570 is not particularly strong here. It's about the same as the 3060, and it outperforms the 6600 non-XT. The price is noteworthy, although the B580 is overall more competitive in raw performance. In the least, lows are comparable in this test to non-Intel parts. At 1080p, performance falls overall as compared to competition. This is consistent with other tests. The gap from the B570 to the B580 remains 15%, with the 4060 now leading the B570 by 30% and the B580 by 7%. AMD's RX 7600 holds a similar lead. Dying Light 2 is up now at 1440p. The B570 ran at 53 FPS average in what's one of the strongest relative showings, unbound, for this card. This has it ahead of the 4060 by 8%. Lows are also better, which is important for ARC. The lead over the 7600 is 13%. As for the B580, Intel's $250 baseline model is about 18.6% ahead of the B570 here. At 1080p, the B580 maintained an 18.7% advantage at 87 FPS to 73 FPS average over the B570. The RTX 4060 lands between the two and is closer to the B570. Intel has marginally better 0.1% low averages here. The RX 7600 is roughly tied with the B570 in this test. We're moving on to ray tracing now, tested with the unbound configuration. We'll keep this as focused as possible. These tests are not comparable to the rasterization performance, especially as some settings, such as upscaling, may change. In Resident Evil 4 at 4K with RT and FSR, the B570 ran at 43 FPS average and with lows overall acceptable for its average. That has it ahead of the RTX 4060 and a strong showing for Intel. The B580 leads the B570 by 16%, which puts it functionally identical in performance to the RTX 4060 Ti. At 1440p, the B570 ran at 66 FPS average and tied with the RX 7600 in just about every metric. Considering the B570's price advantage at the time of writing, that's a competitive spot to be in for Intel. The RTX 4060 leads the B570 by 8%, flipping from what we saw at the higher resolution, and consistent with knowledge that ARC disproportionately scales, better that is, at higher resolution. The B580 is 15% ahead of the B570 here. At 1080p, the B570 ran at 81 FPS average. The RX 7600 now slightly outperforms it. Realistically, these are the same perceived performance, but lower resolution performance scaling remains stronger on NVIDIA and AMD. The RTX 4060 is now up at 95 FPS average, a lead over the B570 of 17%. Of course, there's a price difference too. The B580 is about tied with the RTX 4060. Dying Light 2 is up with RT now. At 1080p, the B570 ran at 55 FPS average and held proportional lows, which is what we want. These results have it close enough to the RTX 4060 that they're experientially the same. The RTX 4060 has a lead of 5% over the B570, with the B580 leading both at its 65 FPS average. The B580's average frame rate is 18% higher than the B570 in a notable distinction. The RX 7600 lands below all of these, closer to the RTX 3060 and below even the A580. Intel's Arc has overall strong RT in this title. Dragon's Dogma 2 with RT is not that way though. At 1080p, the B570 ran at 39 FPS average. Unfortunately for Intel, this is one of its worst relative results. Ray tracing in this game is hard for the Intel cards. They don't maintain the scaling from elsewhere when tested against the 7600 or the RTX 4060 here. At 1440p, the B570 holds a 31 FPS average, the B580 a 36 FPS average, and the 7600 and 4060 both just under 40 FPS average. Again, Intel is disproportionately disfavored in this test set. Cyberpunk with RT medium is next. Battlemage remains super competitive here, with the B570 performing better than the RTX 4060. The average frame rate is about the same, but the RTX 4060 suffers from wildly inconsistent frame times in this test. We showed that in the B580 review with the frame time plot, where the 4060 was spiky as a result of its VRAM limitation. The B580 keeps its 16% lead over the B570 in this test, with both outdoing the 4060. The RTX 4060 Ti even struggles in this one, also suffering from inconsistent run-to-run variance and low performance for 0.1%. AMD has problems of its own, mostly just that it's unable to compete in this test. The RX 7600 is down under 30 FPS average with these settings, At this price point, Battlemage is actually the best in this specific test and setup. Black Myth Wukong is up next with RT. This is one of our experimental charts. This designation is reserved for charts where we're still evaluating the methodology and the accuracy, and so you shouldn't assign as much weight to these since we're still leaving open the possibility of some sort of test limitation or issue. As it stands now, the B570 lands between the A750 and the A580 with RT. The B580 is about the same as the RX 7800 XT, with the B570 outperforming the RX 7600. So both are competitive with AMD. NVIDIA is up in orbit, though, with this game. The RTX 4060 is way up at 52 FPS average in this test with these settings. Efficiency testing is up next. This is also part of our suite of experimental tests, meaning that we're still developing methods and that there's more room than typical for possible error or future revisions. This testing is done with an Elmore Labs PMD2 that's been calibrated personally by Elmore on our request. Testing includes both PCIe slot and PCIe cable power consumption, and it excludes all other power, including the CPU. In idle testing, Intel Arc remains power hungry as compared to its competition with our test platform. This is as configured for benchmarking, and it has the B570 pulling about 30 watts idle. The B580 was around 35 watts, so this is overall high. Baldur's Gate 3 at 1440p shows FPS per watt, meaning that higher frame rate and lower power will create the most efficient result. Higher is better. The most efficient device here so far is the 4060 Ti of those tested. The B580 was in the middle of the pack at 0.52 FPS per watt. That had it between the 6600 series. The B570 is more efficient than the B580 at 0.55 FPS per watt and below the RX 7800 XT. Final Fantasy XIV at 1440p is an okay showing for the B570. At 0.54 FPS per watt, it's near the RTX 4060 and better than the B580. This is an okay spot to be in for Intel. At 1080p, the B570 produces 0.81 FPS per watt and sits again below the RTX 4060 and above the B580 and 7800 XT. Against AMD, Intel is looking good, but NVIDIA maintains its advantage here. In Black Myth, at 1080p, the B570 sits between the 4060 and the B580 again. Performance is acceptable overall and far improved from the A series, like the A580 or A770. Cyberpunk is the last one. This one's a pretty good showing for Intel. The B570 isn't tied with the RTX 4060, but it's getting a lot closer. The 0.28 FPS per watt result is far improved over the 7800 XT and puts it in fourth of the devices tested so far for efficiency. Note that the 4090 looks a lot less efficient here than it is, not particularly efficient, but because it's becoming bound by other components at this resolution. All right, that's it for this one. So you got all the charts. You can make the decision. Some quick highlights here. A lot of this is the same general feeling as the B580 in the sense that Intel has definitely improved. That is demonstrable. It's very clear. And over Alchemist, they have certainly picked up from where they were. So B580 and the B570 are often outperforming the A750 or the A770, which are larger configs, especially the A770. And so that's a good place for Intel to be against itself. Now, against competition, they do trade back and forth a lot. So there's some games where the B570 is similar to or even a little bit exceeding the RTX 4060. There's other situations where it's the opposite. The trend that persists is that the higher the resolution is, regardless of this driver overhead discussion, this has been true since day one, since we posted our review of the B580, the higher the resolution is, typically, the more the Battlemage series cards will either gain on their competition or pull away from them, depending on where they started. And so you can look at the other way too. You can say, as you approach lower resolutions like 1080p, then they get closer together. And a lot of times they flip. So in some of these charts, you'll see the 4060 flip with the B580 or something at 1080p and maybe 1440p, or they're equal there. And then the B580 might gain a lead at 4K. And that sort of remains true with the B570, with the exception that it is a little bit of a weaker device, at least when not overclocked. And as a result, the 4060 is more distant from it than you would see with the B580. So now, like in the B580 review, one of the big things is we did not have any spectacular failures and crashes this time. So the B580, we had one that I can remember mentioning. There might be more in there, but the one I remember was in Cyberpunk with, I think it was specifically ultra settings for the B580 review. We didn't have that this time with this one. So that might have gotten patched in some of the driver updates or something. Maybe we just got lucky. But compared to Alchemist, it's certainly far improved. NVIDIA is still sort of seen as maybe the default driver set in that it is genuinely very reliable. We rarely have problems with NVIDIA's drivers at this point. It is built on like over a decade of updates, decades, I guess, at this point. And you see that in the driver performance and the stability, but Intel's improving for sure. As for value and purchasing, the B580 remains actually a very competitive value. There's an asterisk here we'll come back to. The B570 is much the same. On average, the B580 in our results tends to be about 15 to 16% better than the B570. At the upper end of that, we'll see 18.7, 19%, somewhere in there for the B580 advantage over the B570. At the lower end, we'll see like 10% or so, barring some kind of other major bind happening. I think one might have been as low as 6% in a certain situation. So that's about the difference. That difference more or less aligns with the price difference at $250 versus $220 or so. And then if these get scalped again, don't spend more than seems reasonable on it. 300 plus for any of these cards really is too much.
Is this too much?
So that's it for this one. The driver overhead thing is super interesting. It's an important part of the discussion. Once again, not to sort of say it too much, but in our testing, it's just not emerging the way we do it. However, the things we want to do next as a standalone piece possibly will be a true CPU bind. So that's either we go even lower end on the CPU with the same settings, or what's more likely is we run our CPU review suite settings on it, which is going to be mostly medium settings. We can pull it all the way down to low or something for an unlikely scenario, but one that would maybe force the problem to emerge, just like isolating variables elsewhere in hardware. And then we can look at, okay, what are the situations where maybe this is a problem and how much does it emerge? But if they're moving in step, though, you have to look at, is the scaling still the same? And if it is, then the conclusions are the same. But the sort of situation that we're seeing in some of these games, like some of the esports titles, is that it might not be in step, where NVIDIA is favored in some of those. So we'll explore that. It'll be a standalone. As of right now, what I can say is with the 3 CPUs we tested, with the game settings we use, with the games we use, the conclusions are pretty much aligned in all those situations, except for Baldur's Gate 3 with the 5600X, and then some of those frame time discussions that we had throughout this video. If you really care about the frame time consistency, then just you'll have to watch through it or click through the charts or something. So, or watch the B580 with the frame time section. That's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Check back. We have a lot more coming up. We're going to do some more of the, it's been fun. It's been fun doing the bottleneck type testing. So we'll do some more with that now that we've got a bench up and running for it. And then of course the 50 series should be coming up kind of soon for reviews. So we'll have those as well on the high end. And you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, like by buying some of our shirts, our mod mats for PC building, or our dice kits. And we'll see you all next time.